Hello and welcome to another episode of An Imperfect Leader, Leadership in After Action, a series where leaders look back at decisions they've made and consider a series of questions. I'm Peter Stiepelman, I'm your host, and I'm an imperfect leader. I spent more than 20 years teaching and leading, first in the Oakland Public Schools in Oakland, California, and then in the Midwest, Missouri to be exact, where I was a teacher and a principal and assistant superintendent and then the superintendent of the fourth largest district in the state. I'm constantly striving to learn from my experiences and from the experiences of other leaders. The aim of this podcast is to lift the learning and lift the imperfect leaders up. That way, when you hear the term imperfect, you'll see strength. Strength from the candor needed to recognize imperfection as a real advantage. Let's get started. So today on An Imperfect Leader, we've invited Trisha Kocanda to join us. Trisha is the superintendent of Fremont Schools, a pre-K through 8th grade district outside of Chicago, and prior to that, she served as superintendent for the Winnetka Public School District 36 for 8 years. Wow. Trisha Kocanda, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Thank you, Peter. Glad to be here.
So, Trisha, you and I got to know each other through AASA's National Superintendent Certification Program, and I've been told by those who are listening that when I use acronyms, they're not sure what that means. So AASA is the American Association of School Administrators. It's the National Superintendent Association. Who influenced you to become a school leader?
Yes. It's so interesting because obviously there's a lot of factors that go into kind of being in a position like that of school leadership. If I think about it early on, I actually attribute a lot of my willingness and ability to see myself as a leader from being involved in sports as a child. So I would say that probably was my first foray into actually understanding what it meant to work on a team and have, kind of a shared goal in mind and work together, and had some opportunities all the way through high school, I think, to have some really strong coaches and some not so strong, and what that meant and why I was interested in this team concept and be part of that and helping lead a team. Specifics to school, I was really fortunate. I've been asked this before. I've had some tremendous mentors from when I was even a teacher. My principal really early on gave me opportunities to be a team leader, talked about the importance of strong school leadership and what that meant and how to help kids. And so I had that all the way through when I was a building administrator to even at the central office. I've had some great superintendents and assistant superintendents who weren't afraid to do the tough things for kids. That integrity piece is really strong. So I would say that those were my most influential, but we've also had not so great leaders, and I've had some of those along the way. And that also probably in the end helped me realize how I don't want to make people feel, and be mindful of those gaps and pitfalls as well. So I ask kudos to a few of my great mentors.
I'm glad you mentioned mentors. It's one of the pieces. This podcast is pretty much designed for those who are aspiring to become superintendents, those who are new, and certainly those who are established in leadership. And there seems to be this thread that keeps going through the conversations I've had with superintendents about the importance of mentorship and how you really feel it when there's an absence, and you certainly feel incredibly buoyed when there's a real presence in your life to be able to be vulnerable with somebody, to kind of talk through your thoughts, to be willing to hear the things you don't want to hear necessarily. And so I'm glad to hear that mentorship has played such an important role in your own development. So as I was preparing for this conversation, I found a press release about work that you were a part of in your previous district. It was called Looking at the Portrait of a Graduate, which in education circles has really begun to get a lot of traction. I wonder if you'd tell us a little bit about that work and why it's important.
Yeah, of course. I'm really proud of our portrait that we created in Winnetka. I do believe it really is a reflection on the values of the community and what we hold true for our kids. So kind of to backtrack where it came from, I was going to launch it to my second strategic planning process as superintendent in Winnetka. And I wanted, we were in a position, we were in the midst of the pandemic. We were had a successful first 5-year plan that we were kind of wrapping up, and we wanted to do it a little differently. And I saw actually another superintendent in my network present on this portrait of a graduate idea. And I was hooked, because what it does is it takes the strategic planning process and flips it on its head, from looking at what all the things that adults can do to improve the system, to, in the end, what is it that we want our kids to become? Like, why are we working so hard? What's our commitment? When we really say all means all, what are we trying to achieve for our kids? And so that was a powerful way to think about it. And so as I worked through this strategic plan, and we had representatives, we actually did it via Zoom. We had parents and community leaders. We had high school students who had graduated from our school system, teachers, of course, but a pretty big group. And we worked through this part of the strategic planning process about, what are our aspirations for our kids, and brainstormed a lot of different concepts and characteristics. And so we landed ultimately on, we wanted, and there's descriptors for these, but we wanted every child who went on from our system, 8th grade into high school, to be empathetic, to be an effective communicator, to be a lifelong learner, a global citizen, collaborative, and creative problem solver. And those kind of roll right off, and they seem, pretty typical, but there was a lot of conversation that went behind all that.
When you think about process, and you're coming up with, whether it's a district that's coming up with its values, or in this case, your strategic plan that is really going to be focused on the qualities and traits that children should have as they move out of your system, I can imagine that there were a lot of dialogue around the choice of words or the choice of terms. I wonder if you would talk a little bit about the process.
Yes. So we started with, like we said, with brainstorming in some small groups, and we worked with a partner in this process who kind of gave us some skill sets that you might want to consider. I don't know, it was, maybe 100 different concepts that we could consider. And so we started to narrow those down through conversations and some polling, but just to get us kind of focused on, a set of characteristics that we could actually start to dismantle and talk about, because we also then had to describe what each of those meant, ultimately in a very succinct format. So there was a lot of deliberation. We take feedback either through some surveys or through some small group facilitation. And then there was a leadership group of us of about 5 that would come back together and then try to do the wordsmithing and come back. But we went, I think our first iteration that we came back to the whole group with fell a little flat. I think one of my parents was like, this sounds like a yoga studio, not a school district. So she felt, oh, I don't want to offend anybody. I said, no, but that's part of this process, right? Because we have to strike that balance between it being, the effective side of this, but also wanting to make sure we have really strong, scholars too. So we try to balance that out. But so we had a number of iterations that way, had board members involved, and ultimately landed, I think, in a portrait based on the feedback we got from our staff and parents and even kids we shared it with. It felt that, yes, this represented us. Mm-hmm.
That's great. That's really great. So you spent 8 years in one district, and then now you're leading a new district. And I'm wondering, how has your approach to leadership changed as you begin anew? I guess what I mean is, like, what have you done differently this time that you wish you might have done in 2014 when you first started as a superintendent?
Yes. Well, it's so interesting. I don't know if you felt this way, Peter, when you first became a superintendent, but it's sort of like how I felt when I was a new mom and I brought home my newborn for the first time. And you're like, okay, I'm really in charge of the responsibility of this whole life. And so even though I was an assistant superintendent, until you actually sit in the role and realize that level of responsibility and trying to prioritize and what that means, obviously now having been there and done that for 8 years, and even though it's a new community, I just feel so much more, I guess, confident in the fact of, yes, this is being a superintendent. You can do this. It's wonderful, but it completely depends on the network and relationships that you have within the community. And so I think because I know that, and so assured by that through my experiences, I've been able to, in a new community, that rather than Winnetka was one village basically that I served, when now I have 7 villages in my current district. And so I've been making a point to really understand why I need a good relationship with the village managers, to the law enforcement, to, the various leaders, but also quickly getting into meeting parents and staff. And it's things I would have done early on last time, but now I can, at a far more rapid pace, I can analyze the feedback I'm getting, those relationships, and start to make plans and bring that school board along too. So it's been fun to be an experienced superintendent.
So that's interesting. You know, when one becomes superintendent, they recognize the importance of the internal system, the external system, and how interconnected they are. I think often we spend a lot of time as superintendents attending to the internal piece, and we recognize the importance of the external parties. So your city councils, your city manager, your chamber of commerce, all the different entities, you know, hospitals, everything. And then as you're working as superintendent, you recognize how much interaction you have with them. And so it sounds like as you were moving into this new role, but as an experienced superintendent, you were able to attend to the important piece of like building those relationships right from the beginning.
Yes. And I actually want to put a shout out, just because even how you and I met, Peter, like how important it is to know the other superintendents in this area too, which I had some familiarity. I haven't moved too far from where I was, but it is a new county. And so also just for all those aspiring superintendents, like, and even more so now, I think after the pandemic, we are here for each other. Also, you know, I appreciate the fact of some of my superintendent colleagues who are also like, you want to know this person in the community, and being able to depend on those relationships has been really key.
Yeah, you know, being superintendent can sometimes be really isolating. And I do think post-pandemic leaders have really come together even more than before. I think they were always collegial, but they really are intent on each other's success. So that's exciting to hear that that's happening in your area. In leadership, and I don't think it matters what industry you're in, I think we all find ourselves battling this notion that we're supposed to be perfect. Or pretty darn close. And so the margin of error for making mistakes can also be incredibly razor thin, even thinner for some, as some previous guests have indicated. I'm comfortable saying that I'm imperfect. I have come to embrace that, and I'm interested in your thoughts. How does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
Yes. And I appreciate that's your whole purpose of the podcast is, you know, I'm a big Brene Brown fan. So being able to show that vulnerability is actually, you know, a source of power and a connector in a system. So, I mean, our jobs as superintendents or in education in general is making sure that all these imperfect humans, because nobody's perfect, right, end up being, you know, healthy and active, contributing members of society, so to speak. It's sort of the essence of who we are. So, you know, I think it is a delicate dance sometimes being a superintendent and knowing that there is a tremendous amount of scrutiny, and we've all felt that, especially over the last couple of years. And you are nervous. There's been times you're nervous about some of those decisions you're making. I think through it, you know, my kind of going back to the team philosophy, really being able to depend on your team and being vulnerable with your team, which includes the board at times, you know, or a lot of times, like, we're trying to make the best decisions possible for our kids. Here's our staff. Here's all the information we have. Here's why we're making this decision. And knowing that sometimes we're not going to be right. And what I've learned over the last 8 years too, it's this, like, something's going to hit the fan. Like, that's going to happen. You can't avoid it, but it's what you do next that's probably your most important decision. And so I really think it's about then how do you own that, and then what are you going to do about it? Because usually people are actually pretty forgiving if you do that.
One of our values that we came to as a school district, it wasn't one of our initial values. When we came back together to sort of rethink who are we and what do we want for children and what do we want for each other and how do we want to behave and what are going to be our nested patterns, we adopted grace for that very reason, that it is an important piece of forgiving and moving forward and using those experiences as a learning experience. I am also a big Brene Brown fan, and find myself watching her videos as a way to give myself my own pep talk on leadership and how to be a better person and husband and father and all.
I've done the same thing, Peter. I'm just like podcast.
Brene, if you're listening, we love you. So, well, I like to think that imperfect leaders are intentional about seeking to understand the big picture. And this very habit is described by the Water Center for System Thinking as focusing on the forest as well as the details of any one tree. And I thought about that habit when I saw that you had moved to a new school district. And I love this question that they pose to leaders. How can I maintain balance between the big picture and important details? So Trisha, how do you do that? I mean, you've been wildly successful in one district and then have now moved to another district. And so what are some ways that you do that? And I mean, you're the superintendent. You are expected to carry a vision forward, yet every single part of the system is connected to another part. Attending to one area will create opportunities and sometimes tension. And how do you maintain balance between big picture and then those important details?
Yes. It's a great question, right? Kind of sums up, systems leadership in one sort of descriptive sentence. So it is, I mean, it's a challenge. And I think though, our Hippocratic oath as superintendents is we're not going to lose sight of the fact that we're going to make those decisions that are going to positively impact kids, period. And so from the kind of biggest picture, it's the values that we're creating as a community, and as a new superintendent now building my shared vision within the community, or being able to be unapologetic about what we're going to stand for and the decisions we're going to make, and making sure that becomes part of the administrative team, part of the board, that we communicate that with our community, with our staff. And so, in the end, if we're going to be making every decision around making sure all kids can grow and achieve and ultimately become contributing members of society, and then being able to depend on your team of administrators as well, trusting them to work on the details, coming back to our team and sharing updates or things that happen and problem solving together, but really allowing the system itself and your principals, as long as we're clear on what we stand for and what we value, allowing them then to have that autonomy, that defined autonomy, to then make that happen, and having, though, I guess, that circle of trust too. So when things don't go well, to be able to come forward and say, this didn't go as planned. So I think it's a lot of that kind of shared planning, being clear though about that vision, but really depending and being willing as a leader to depend on your central office or your cabinet and your building leadership to make some of those decisions as well, and then supporting them.
I wonder if you could think of an example, and as you're thinking about it, I'll give you an example from my experience. So I can remember in the past, adoption of curriculum, for example, would have been a small, incredibly committed and dedicated group, and it could be argued that it wasn't incredibly inclusive in terms of community feedback and board participation and all those types of things that are important. Student voice, as you indicated with the portrait of a graduate, I love the fact that you included student voice. They're the ones most probably invested in their futures, and so having their participation is incredibly important. And so there would be sort of a community opportunity, but the community would have to come to a district office, go into a room, look at materials, give some feedback, and then leave. And then when things weren't going as well as we might have hoped, the process was dissected in a way that said, this didn't really include other people. So we had to rethink the way that we did things, and we actually adopted something we called a project, which was to have materials from 2 different publishers. We had already talked to other districts that were incredibly successful with their reading programs and approaches to reading. And then we spent the entire year having teacher feedback and principal feedback and parent feedback and student feedback and regular visits by board members. And then at the end of that year, we're able to look at these 2 different options and make a really good decision, or at least a thoughtful decision, based on a more inclusive process. And so I'm curious, when you discuss, doing this as a shared decision as opposed to one point of failure, but a lot of dialogue, do you have an example of how you might have done that?
Yes, you actually prompted me when you talked about that experience. And so, and it's something I think that's hopefully somewhat universal these days, but we realized that looking at the way we were serving students, for instance, we were still too reliant on specific pull-out programs or services, right? Whether it be for language, whether it be for special education, whether it be even for social emotional support. And so we wanted to shift to a more inclusive environment for our kids, more integrated services. And so doing that, we realized it was more of a shift, which they often are in culture, the shift in thinking and mindset versus just what instructional, program you're going to commit to or whatnot. So we did a lot of learning as a leadership team, as an administrative team, and we brought our school board into it and some of our teacher leaders as well. And then once we kind of understood the research behind inclusionary practices, we also then had some focus groups with parents to try to help understand what their experiences were for their children and how we were serving them. And so really trying to understand, I guess, both the empathy side of things about how does this look from a child's perspective, and talking, kind of looking at that. We actually shadowed students as well as leaders. And so we took that experience, and then over time, and it sounds like you did the same thing, Peter, like this can't, if you really are having a process that you're involving a lot of people, it takes time. So then we kind of had more focused professional learning, both for the staff, and then we mirror that learning and give those opportunities to our parents as well about, what does it look like to have more integrated systems of support for kids. And then, built that and eventually into our annual goals and strategic planning, and started to chip away at some of the data we wanted to see change so that we could see that evidence of growth.
Trisha, that is an excellent example of having this big picture of what you would want for children, the environment you want, getting into the details of that, working through, taking the time to do that, coming back out, seeing almost from a balcony view, what does the dance floor look like, how are we doing, and knowing that work is never done. And
no.
So, but I'm glad to know what a great achievement. That's fantastic. An Imperfect Leader, Leadership in After Action is supported by ILAA, a firm dedicated to supporting aspiring new and established leaders. For more information, please find them at human-centeredleaders.com. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. My guest today is Trisha Kocanda, Superintendent of Fremont 79. In this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they had to make and then discuss, what happened and what got overlooked and those types of things. So why don't we start? Trisha, what happened?
Sure. So I was trying to think of something that I learned, especially like in my first year as a superintendent. So there's something very specific. I remember even noting to myself, I will forever learn from this experience. So I'm going to focus on the importance of succession planning and building capacity with your team and having kind of a long-term vision. So I had my first year as superintendent. I had come from within the system. Like I said, there's a lot going on your first year, even though in that case, I knew our community and school system well. You still are adjusting to this leadership role. And I had a great administrative team, and things were going well. And I remember in March, an assistant principal who was new that year was phenomenal, had a wonderful trajectory ahead of him. And he came to me and said, "You know what? I've put my name in for a couple of principalships. I think I'm going to get one of these. I feel pretty good about it." And I remember feeling that conflict of, oh no, he's awesome. How am I losing him? How this happened? And then also, of course, happiness for him, because he deserves it. And he is today. He's very successful, and everything, I had seen in him then years ago is coming to fruition. So what I did is I realized I can't let this ever happen again. Like, I have to focus, even though there's so many things going on, I have to focus on the individual leaders in my system and understand, kind of their desires and aspirations for the future, and how to help either build that in to, our system. Ideally, if that wouldn't be possible, then how to support them now. Because I didn't want to be in a position where I would lose another great leader, so to speak.
I've been surprised that there have been leaders in other industries who have been listening to the podcast and noting to me that there are topics here that are totally comparable, and that it doesn't need to be a conversation about education, for example, that, succession planning is a big issue in any industry. How do you maintain the momentum? How is there cohesion throughout the entire district or throughout the entire organization? And how do you make sure that the people that you note to be excellent, that they know that there's a future for them within your own system? So what got overlooked?
Yeah. And actually, I just want to play on that. I learned a lot, a few of my board members too, is talking about board members can be assets, came from, corporate experiences, and they were helpful too in shaping some of that strategy for succession planning. So that's just an example of how your board can be helpful too as cross industry. So clearly if I'm going to be real concrete in my, at least the goal setting process with my administrators, asking the first simple question of where do you see yourself in 5 years? And what are your aspirations and what professional learning? I think that's a simple piece of it. And then the larger piece of it is looking at the system as a whole and looking at your leadership structures and saying, okay, who is near retirement, or who is likely going to be moving to another position, even if it's outside the district because you don't have that trajectory available internally, being able to map that out, literally in the next 3 to 5 years. And then, of course, then you're building with an individual potentially, which has happened, kind of this vision of what could happen next and what we would need to do, what experiences I need to help give that, for instance, if it was a building leader who wanted to become a central office administrator in curriculum, let's say teaching and learning, how do I start to give them more ownership and leadership at a district level so they have a better skill set and experience set before they come into that role too. So I was missing all of that.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, do you look for the individuals to come to you, or is it that you have been told that there's somebody within the system that is just a superstar, and or is it a combination? I'm curious. There are some people who are go-getters who will come to us and say, I really have an interest in moving into another role in the district, and I want to be of service. Are there committees I can be on? Those types of things. And then there are others who, quite frankly, are often underrepresented within our systems that we have to go to because the traditional routes have been closed to them.
Correct. And that is true too. So over time, yes, you start to understand. I think your question was like, does it all have to be like raise my hand and hear from them? No, I think actually talking actively as an admin team about who, especially in the, teacher leaders and things, who has great potential. And let's purposely look at maybe individuals that don't see themselves because they haven't had a model or an opportunity to see themselves in a leadership role, and being able to have those conversations. I know at one point we were really focused on this internal leadership piece in my last district. And so everyone at the district office was to really look at within their department and find some 5 people in the system that had real potential to be a leader in that area, either officially or, more informally. And have those conversations.
That's a real intentional example of how one might do that. That's fantastic. I also have appreciated that in this conversation, we're both using our superintendent superpowers, which is to reflect back what we think we've heard. So it's hilarious. It's like, what I think I hear you saying, and then you're like, what I think I hear you saying is, and if I captured you correctly.
We have done that, yes.
It's really funny. So what did you learn about relationships, or maybe, what new relationships were formed?
Yes. Well, it kind of stems on to what you just said, like relationships, not everybody's going to see themselves in a leadership role or, so being able to be, because people like that feeling, right? If you're a superintendent or someone else, even a colleague that says, you have real potential to be, in this role. I mean, that boosts someone quite a bit and allows them, even when they don't think it's possible to see them in that role, to see them. So I think the influence that even just seeing people have individually, right, being able to recognize that is important. And then also the idea of forming relationships over time. I've been able to build a larger network, right? Because now succession planning doesn't even mean those internally, but you also start to keep a network outside and say, okay, if a role opens up, this would be a great person who, I even had someone that was in Winnetka who was a great teacher leader, instructional leader, but I knew needed probably some experience in a different system. So she became an assistant principal, different system. And when I had an opening I knew was coming up, I called her and said, hey, let's go to breakfast. Okay. So I think keeping connected to, your wider network and building that, being really explicit about keeping connections. And you never know when you might need to pick those back up.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about also just the relationship to the fact that, particularly since you're in the Chicago area, there are lots of districts, and that as people grow in your district, demonstrate incredible performance, find other opportunities in other districts with, with your blessing and support, that they also become colleagues, even if they remain outside your district, and potentially they come back based on the fact that you might have openings. But like, what an incredible network of talented people within your whole region that know you, they know your heart, they know your passion for kids, and vice versa, that you know that when you're talking with them, you're going to get the very best information, and that and it's reliable. And sometimes when we don't build those relationships, we wonder how meaningful the interaction is going to be, or how enduring that relationship could be. So that I hadn't thought about that part of it.
Yeah. And it takes intention. You have to be intentionally remain connected, which is hard sometimes given everything else.
So you have an incredible assistant principal. You're early in your career as a superintendent, and the individual says, I've got opportunities, and I feel really good about it, and I'm leaving, and leaves you thinking, oh my gosh, I've got to build a better system for letting people know or elevating individuals within the organization. So the next question is, what frustrated you? And I'm not sure if it was a frustration as much as a sort of an awakening of some sort, but
yeah,
I guess I'll ask the question, what frustrated you?
Well, yeah, I mean, clearly I was frustrated that I missed it. Like I missed an opportunity, I wonder about, well, if I had more of some intentionality around this, could I have kept him? That's certainly frustrating, but I think too, and maybe not so much just me, but it's, I don't know if the right word, but it's disruptive, frustrating to the school and district environment, right? When a good leader moves on too. So I think I saw that impact as well. Now we've certainly got another great person to go in, but I think that was a frustrating part, is not that it could have potentially been avoided. So that's why it was, like you said, the awakening that I wasn't gonna, try as best of my ability, try not to let that happen without some effort.
So one of the reasons why I started the podcast also was I thought that post-pandemic leaders nationwide are craving authentic story and genuine learning, and recognizing that they're not alone as they try to navigate a really complex, highly regulated system, and often the superintendent is quite alone. Another reason is for what you just said in terms of it's disruptive when you have turnover in leadership. The national average for superintendents is less than 3 years. That is an alarming statistic. It's even more disruptive in an urban or metropolitan district that has, it's less than 2 years, I believe. And so the thought here is like, how can we maybe have an impact and share some of our learnings so that potential mistakes could be avoided? Because it's year 3 that becomes that sort of pivotal year when someone stays or doesn't stay. So I appreciated the thought about, in terms of like, it's disruptive. And it's not just disruptive for that individual has to move, sure. It's, what are we in the business for? I mean, it's really disruptive for children, for the adults that serve children. So the teachers and when you are constantly having turnover, then you feel as if there's going to be a new vision or a new program or and so it becomes exhausting.
Yeah, you lose traction, right? Yeah.
Yeah, you lose traction. Exactly. A new strategic plan. Like, okay. And then you get jaded. You're a 20-year teacher and you've seen 90
Yes.
strategic plans. You go like, I'll just wait for the next one because,
Right.
it'll be here in a couple of years.
Right.
What could you have done differently?
Yes. And that's what I try to then reflect upon and make sure it didn't happen. So again, right. So what I, did differently was I was far more intentional in my practice of goal setting, to be more explicit to the individual about how they see themselves in building those opportunities. Like, and I give an example too, like, how do we talk about this more openly to as a district leadership team, and provide some opportunities. I mean, most districts have some sort of professional learning programming, and a lot of it call it university systems, like within your own district or things like that, where there's coursework. And how do you start to we were more explicit about selecting teachers to potentially lead courses or be part of the district's professional learning leadership. And then also at a far wider scale, do differently, as I mentioned before, kind of building that 3 to 5 year look at your trajectory of your whole leadership team, and then being open with your board about that. That was something that I also learned over time how important that was. So the board could see some of that thinking. And because sometimes you had to adjust, I fortunately worked with a board that was supportive of making some of those tough decisions with me if we needed to move some people around or think differently or invest differently. And so I think that's also something that is important to think about in this capacity building.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it is an investment if you're thinking and you're approaching your board and saying, this is intentional, this is about succession planning. I do think that there's a real role in creating positions for eventual succession planning. And if your board understands it, it's more likely they'll support it. So I guess in the end, what was something that was good that came out of the situation?
So what came out of it? So I've learned from that, right? So I was able to, over my 8 years in Winnetka, able to purposely build at least 3 different pathways for leaders that came to fruition, right? Where we were able to build a plan, develop some experiences and skill sets, and ultimately for the schools, like you said, to be least disruptive to our kids, we're able to have great internal folks take those positions on. And then also what I said is use a network so that even at times, I think there should be a blend of internal and external leadership shifts, because you always, I think, grow quite a bit when you also have, a different perspective from someone who's been in a different system. So being able to have that marriage between your internal development plan and your external network and bringing those together, we were able to make some really good decisions for our organization that ultimately helped advance our goals and minimize that disruption of kids.
That had to feel really, really good. That's great.
Yeah, it did.
In the end, this podcast is designed for aspiring and early in their career and established leaders to learn from the experience of other leaders. So with that in mind, what advice would you give to an aspiring leader?
As a new leader, build your network. So as an emerging leader, start, even if you're a teacher and you're really focused with your team or department that you're on, extend yourself out beyond just that team or department within your school system. Connect with regional partners. So if you're, an assistant principal, connect out with other assistant principals in your area. Just start to build the network, because you'll grow stronger. You'll be able to be vulnerable. You'll be able to talk about challenges and get good advice. But you'll also then, as you want to continue to grow professionally, you've built now a network they know you and will think of you when opportunities arise.
Trisha Kocanda, thank you so much for joining me on An Imperfect Leader. You continue to inspire, and I'm so thrilled for the people in Fremont. That's amazing. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Peter, for doing this good work.
Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falvo created the Daruma doll butterfly artwork. Imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It is a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. And I'm proud to be an imperfect leader, so I hope you'll join me next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader, Leadership in After Action.